Welcome to Resilience Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Ostrolenk. This show is about building better humans, institutions, and systems. On the show, I'll be interviewing many different experts from across many different fields, including human optimization, health and fitness, team building, mind-body medicine. In the institutional space, we're looking at different institutions and how we can create new ones, new models and maps, including in medicine, in education, in intelligence community, in law enforcement, in the military, especially in the special operations community. Thanks for being here and enjoy the show.
I want to welcome Dr. Robert Lufkin. He's a physician, professor, and a leading voice challenging the conventional medical model around chronic disease and aging. After decades in academic medicine, including roles at UCLA and USC, he began questioning a system that often manages symptoms instead of addressing root causes. Today, his work focuses on metabolic health, lifestyle interventions, and what it truly takes to extend to extend not just lifespan, but health span. He's the author of Lies I Taught in Medical School, where he pulls back the curtain on outdated paradigms in modern medicine and offers a more proactive, patient-centered, empowered approach to healing and longevity. Dr. Lufkin is part of a growing movement redefining medicine, from reactive care to personal responsibility, from disease management to optimized living. Rob, good to see you.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on your program.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. I track all your work on Twitter. I think is where I follow you, and you're very prolific. I'll give you an opportunity to plug yourself on Twitter. And I just love what you're pushing out there in terms of like new paradigms, what we really need to embody here in the States, especially when I look at some of the statistics and the declining health that we have here in our country. But before we kind of get into medicine, the paradigms of medicine and health and disease, who's Robert? And what led you to kind of challenge the conventional medical model and support a whole new system that's evolving now?
Yeah, the great question. I'm a physician, as you said. I've spent my entire career basically as a medical school professor, which means I get to not only practice medicine, but also I get to do research, which means science and write peer-reviewed papers. And I've written a couple hundred of those. My lab has received millions of dollars from drug companies and pharmaceutical makers and device makers and the government to do research. And then also you get to teach, and more often is not learn from the students and the young healthcare professionals that you're interacting with. And so that's basically what I was doing when suddenly I came down with four chronic diseases that sort of was changed the whole course of my life. I came down with these four diseases, and these are common chronic diseases that most adult Americans have at least one of these. And so I went to my doctor, and the doctor prescribed a medicine for each one of the diseases, and said something about lifestyle, but uh, didn't really emphasize. And I said, "Well, what about lifestyle? Does that work?" And they go, "Nah, that really doesn't work. You're going to be on these pills for the rest of your life, so get used to it." And at that point, my daughters were fairly young, and I realized that wasn't going to end well for me and for them. Uh, and so it forced me to kind of take a deep dive myself and really question what I understood about it and see if there was any alternatives. And I realized that there's a explosion of knowledge about this space that I wasn't aware of, and that many of my colleagues are still not aware of. In other words, the things that we can do and the way these diseases work and all, in particular, how effective lifestyle was. And I changed my lifestyle, did some relatively simple things, and in a matter of months, I went back to the doctors and they couldn't believe it. They thought the labs were broken or something. But anyway, long story short, I got off all medications, and now the diseases have been reversed. Essentially, they've gone away. Yes.
Would you mind sharing what they were?
Sure, it was diabetes, it was, gout, it was, high blood pressure, hypertension, which most Americans have, and then also dyslipidemia, abnormal blood lipids there. Seemingly unrelated diseases, but actually, they share a common root cause, and that was the whole story of it. And so when I reversed them myself, uh, at that point, I made it my mission to really spend my time helping others take back their health, not make the same mistakes that I did. And I wrote a book about it that it unexpectedly became a New York Times bestseller, and there was a lot of attention coming in. So now I've been continuing to work in that space and really being critical of Western medicine a little bit. And, your your audience is probably saying, wait a minute, you're critical of Western medicine. You're a part of the problem. You're a professor at a medical school, right? And by Western medicine, I mean Orthodox medicine, not necessarily West or East. Eastern world has this problem too, but it's kind of modern medicine. And the medical schools are the keepers of medical orthodoxy, kind of the rules and the belief systems. And I'm the book is very critical of Western medicine, but you know, full. I have to say, Western medicine in the 20th century. You and I were both around in the 20th century. We know that Western medicine, through the pills, the surgeries, but also largely public health measures, really transformed the lives of people around the world. It made us all better, healthier. It was nothing short of magical. And even today, if I get hit by a car, I'm going to want Western medicine. I'm going to want, that blood transfusion. I'm going to want my ruptured spleen removed. I'm going to want things. So there are things that Western medicine still does really well, better than anything else. But the problem is there's a set of chronic diseases that include the ones that I have, and these go all the way from obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart attack, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and even mental illness. These chronic diseases, although they were present in the 20th century, now in the 21st century, they've exploded into literally a tsunami of numbers in biblical proportions, biblical numbers, where by some estimates, this subset of chronic diseases take up 80% of healthcare resources. But it gets worse. The problem is when Western medicine takes the same pills and surgeries that were so effective in the 20th century for the issues there and applies it to these chronic diseases, the pills and surgeries may work for treating the symptoms, and they may be life-saving in the short term, but for many of the disease, arguably most of them, they don't arrest the underlying disease, and then the disease continues to progress and progress and progress. So if I take the pill or surgery, I'm just kind of taking care of the symptoms, but not really addressing the root cause, and that's really the issue here.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into that. But a question back to you, like the four diseases you're diagnosed with, the pills you took. How did you go about studying what lifestyle factors might have contributed or even be causal to any of those conditions? And you shared with us too, like there's underlying something underneath it all, probably connects all those conditions. Maybe it's inflammation. I'm curious your answer might be, but how did you look at the lifestyle factors? What did you modify in yourself? And how did you learn that there's maybe an underlying factor that contributed to all the diseases? They were only symptoms, really, possibly, of something underneath all that.
Right. They were, instead of four diseases, there's only one disease, and there were four symptoms that manifested differently. But to your question about lifestyle, I mean, I grew up, my mom was a dietitian. So she worked at hospitals into her 80s, and I was immersed in the idea that somehow what we ate mattered. Unfortunately, the belief for dietitians and back then, and even to some extent today, was based on the idea that a low fat, high carbohydrate diet was healthy. So although we thought nutrition mattered, we made the wrong decisions on nutrition. So I mean, everybody agrees we should have a healthy lifestyle. But the question is, what is a healthy lifestyle? And then the other factor is, how important is that healthy lifestyle? And I think most doctors today sort of feel similar to the response I got. Well, it doesn't really work. You need to take pills and that's better. On the other hand, out of full defense, as a patient, I'll confess, I'm basically lazy, like anybody else. If I go into my doctor's office and he goes, "You have a disease, right? You have diabetes, right?" Okay. So he goes, "You can either take a pill, and be done with it, or I'm going to give you a lecture about eating and changing your lifestyle, and you have to literally change who you become." And for any of us, we don't want to change who we are really. And taking a pill doesn't change who I am. For 1 minute in the morning, I take the pill. Even surgery, if they say you can have surgery or you could do lifestyle, most people will do surgery because if it's one and done, even if I take a week off from work, it's still better than changing who I am as a person. That's what lifestyle comes down to. And that's a fair thing. People would always rather have a pill. But the problem is, and I think this is what's not communicated to people, is that it's not an equivalence. In other words, it's not like, oh, we'll give you a pill or we'll give you insulin for your diabetes, and then, or you can do lifestyle. It doesn't matter. They're both the same. It's not true. In the case of diabetes, you could take the pills. You start off with metformin and sulfonylureas, and then gradually you go on to, this is type 2 diabetes, which is 90% of diabetes, which the AMA just came out with that one-third of teenagers in America now have pre-diabetes, which is diabetes. It's the same thing, and adults are, huge numbers of them. But the point is, when we treat diabetes with the pills, and the medicines and the injections, for most cases, diabetes remains a chronic progressive disease. What does that mean? Well, it gets worse over time. What do you mean gets worse? Well, what's the number one cause of surgical amputations in hospitals in America? Type 2 diabetes. What's the number one cause of renal failure and dialysis? Type 2 diabetes. Number one cause of retinal blindness? Type 2 diabetes. And heart attack, stroke, Alzheimer's, mental illness, these are all driven by diabetes. Um, so I take the pills at surgery, but I'm going to face these complications down my life. In other words, I haven't arrested the disease; it continues to progress. Now, I'm not recommending that anyone stop their insulin or stop any prescription medicine that any doctor has told them, because to be very clear, these pills, these surgeries, for example, insulin is life-saving. If I have high blood sugar, people can die from that. So these pills and surgeries will save your life on the short term, but in many cases, they don't address the root cause. So what's the alternative? Lifestyle. Type 2 diabetes is a problem of insulin resistance, which is basically carbohydrate toxicity or intolerance. And basically, there of the three macronutrients your audience probably knows in our diet, fat and protein are required for life. We have to eat those or we'll die. The third group is called carbohydrates, which contains starches and sugars. Interestingly, there's no requirement for those. If we don't eat them, we can make glucose from fats and proteins. And there are even some societies, some human groups who don't eat any carbohydrates. And it's interesting, carbohydrates is what drives insulin resistance in the majority of people. For most, if not all people, or the majority diabetics, if you restrict carbohydrates, you can decrease their medications, in some cases get them off medications. And this has actually been shown in prospective randomized controlled trials from Virta and other companies. So this is known. So if I reverse my type 2 diabetes like I did with diet, I'm no longer diabetic. I mean, if I eat a bunch of sugar and stuff, I will eventually drive it back that way. But right now, I take no medications. My glucose is under control. and I'm basically healthy. And the issue is patients are not informed of that, hey, you could take these pills, but you're going to get foot amputation and blindness and renal failure and higher risk of everything else. Or you could just change your diet and you don't have to worry about those, at least from the diabetes.
I'd love for you to go back though to the moment you're like, wait, lifestyle factors, I need to look into them. Because at the time, if I don't know exactly when this was, but I imagine at the time, all of the institutions, nutrition, medicine, federal, state government, they were all pushing higher carb, low fat diets. So how did you discover like, wait, there might be other options out there since even the full mainstream was not supportive of the keto diet as example, or low carb diet or whatever you want to say. Like I was fortunate. Weston A. Price Foundation, I discovered them 30 years ago. Or, I became friendly with Rob Wolf, so I learned about the paleo diet and then keto, but this is 20 some years ago. Like, how did you discover and break through the fog of the conventional system?
Yeah, I mean, the orthodox teaching of to avoid heart disease and avoid a heart attack, which is the number one killer of all of us, you, I, and most of our listeners. Statistically, that's what we will die of is a heart attack. So heart disease is on everyone's radar, and there was a belief that saturated fats, eggs and fat on the steak, would drive heart disease. And so the trade-off was made, we're gonna get rid of fat in the diet, and of the three macronutrients, it's a zero-sum game. You don't really adjust protein that much. So if you lower the fat, you've got to raise the carbohydrates. And that's exactly what happened. You get the snack well phenomena. You get, cookies that are low-fat cookies, but they're high sugar. Low-fat yogurt is high sugar yogurt. So it was a trade-off that was with the best of intentions, but it actually turns out it drives metabolic disease and drives insulin resistance, which arguably is a greater cause of heart attack than LDL cholesterol or high fat. If you look at the hazard ratios for metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance and diabetes, they drive heart attacks more than LDL cholesterol. And that's a whole nother discussion as well.
Yeah.
But that was kind of it, the belief was that you avoid fats because they're harmful. Then I started seeing some studies where people reverse their diabetes just by going to a low carb diet. And I go, what's going on there? And I didn't discover this. There was obviously other people that were doing it, and um but that was kind of the wake up call. And then I realized that this same metabolically favorable diet and lifestyle not only decreased my risk of type 2 diabetes, but also made the gout go away, made the hypertension go away, made the obesity go away. That wasn't a problem with me, but it still works on obesity. It also works on heart disease. It also works on cancer in some ways. It also works on mental illness, and it also works on Alzheimer's disease. And it's a common basic metabolic dysfunction at the mitochondrial level, really.
So, like 25, 30 years ago or so, whenever it was, the conventional wisdom was high carb, low fat is good for you. What would you say? That's been broken up. Like there are more and more people like you in the medical field and the dietitian field and influencers all over social media who are pushing, carnivore or low carb or keto or various things along those lines. What would you say that you're seeing as the next myth that we're now starting to look behind the scenes and starting to break apart?
Well, along with the low carb ethos, or that people who are into low carb, there's another possible target there that the evidence isn't as strong for, but it's growing, and that's something called seed oils, which
Okay.
are processed oils as drivers of insulin resistance, as drivers of inflammation, and I lump together inflammation, oxidation, and insulin resistance as common manifestations of an underlying metabolic dysfunction. They're all kind of related, and if we turn mTOR down, we turn down inflammation. We also have low glucose. We turn up ketones. So it's all the same thing going on there. But I think seed oils, the evidence isn't as strong, but it's I think it may be the next big thing. And who knew, for the first time in my lifetime, we have national leaders in our government
And
using the words, junk food and seed oils and metabolic health and insulin resistance. And I mean, I'm not political. I love my Republican friends. I love my Democratic friends. I wish they just get along better. But I think it's so encouraging that now we're having a national conversation. You know, Forget whatever party's in there.
yeah,
Hopefully,
yeah.
when the Democrats come in, they'll continue the conversation. But we're now paying attention to, glyphosates and, artificial food coloring and, food flavorings and, different things like that, that really people are paying attention to their health and longevity now, which is so
Which
exciting.
which is, very, very exciting. And one of the thing that which is kind of cool is, and not to get into politics, but the last administration, I spent a lot of time in the peptide space with a lot of doctors who do peptides, and there was concern, like the FDA was starting to shut down access to peptides. And that now seems to be opening up a lot more. The federal government is not doing that, or even psychedelics. It seems like psychedelics will no longer, they will soon to be recognized with a medical use. Not gonna be
Absolutely.
on the streets, but, be able to go see your psychiatrist or your medical doctor and do your thing with them and peptides, and I gotta imagine there's so many other really interesting things on the cutting edge of regenerative medicine that
Yeah.
closer, sooner access to, because 'cause we'll have a, much more liberal, not in the political sense, but liberal approach to medicine. Like, "Hey, let's try these things. Let's test them out." It's not just about a small category of drugs and surgery.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, the number one prescription drug is a peptide, right? The GLP-1 agonists and,
Right, right.
and psilocybin and MDMA are, hopefully gonna get through the FDA soon. And even more on the edge is, the right to try idea, where many states across the country, allow you have a right to try law if you're within 6 months of death, which means you can try a drug that usually they have to be through phase 1 clinical trials of the FDA. So it's not like you inject chlorine into your veins or something, but you can there's certain drugs that people can't try now, even though they've had some testing and screening. But even better is some states like Montana, and others are probably going to follow. They've reworked the right to try thing, because if you want to try things for longevity, the right to try law, I looked it up. You've got to be 103 years old before your life expectancy is 6 months, so or less. So
Pretty close.
it's a narrow window there. But Montana's is their right to try laws are any consenting adult of sound mind. So basically, anyone can. And we're looking at opening up clinics in Montana for things like partial epigenetic reprogramming for longevity. We're looking at mitochondrial transplantation, for basically reversing aging. And when you reverse aging, just like Dave Sinclair's doing in Boston with Life Biosciences, the interesting thing is these chronic diseases that I mentioned, most of them are driven by aging. It's the greatest risk factor, your age. Uh, and if you're able to reverse the age of the cells through transplantation or reprogramming, the idea is the diseases go away, and we're testing it this year in Boston. I mean, Dave Sinclair's company and other companies are beginning to look at it too. But the idea is, in Dave's case, they're using Yamanaka factors in the eye for age-related blindness, and they're not necessarily treating the blindness directly, but they're using Yamanaka factors to reprogram the epigenome to a younger age. And if the cells are younger, they don't have these diseases. I mean, think about it. Like if I'm 70 and I get Alzheimer's disease, if I could rewind my cells to 40,
Yeah, yeah.
most 40-year-olds don't get Alzheimer's disease, so you could basically decrease the risk of these chronic diseases by treating the ultimate underlying cause, which is age, age-related, you could say metabolic dysfunction, mitochondrial dysfunction, but aging is fascinating.
And I have a million questions for you. It's great to hear about Montana because I know a lot of people going to Honduras for experimental treatment. So it sounds like
Yeah.
they're here in the United States. That's really nice to hear. In terms of the age-related stuff, you mentioned Dr. Sinclair's work. You said he's in Boston, right? And now is that a primary part of your practice? Is working with longevity and reversing aging?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trained in medical imaging as a radiologist, and I worked in that for a long time as my career. But the older that I get, the more interesting longevity research becomes out of self-interest. I've got two daughters that are, still in high school. I want to be around to see their great grandkids, and so
Well, let me. You also mentioned epigenetics, and I was very fortunate to teach in Epigenetics Academy quite a few years ago. And I got some really bad news because I agree with you on the saturated fat and cholesterol. It was unfortunate mind virus that penetrated this in the culture, but I'm APOE 3/4. So when I was talking to my doc about my bulletproof coffee, is like you're just increasing your risk of Alzheimer's. Now you can reduce you can reduce the chances of it by doing various other things. But I think it was a fascinating lesson for me, but I just wanna ask you more about epigenetics. Like, how does that play in the work you do with clients or patients, because 'cause you're a doctor? And talk about, like, micro-targeting, like, the bioindividuality, like, how I process melatonin and caffeine or whatever it happens to be is different than you, so how you would work with me as a doctor might be different how you work with yourself as a doctor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are general principles about lifestyle that I talk about in my book and that other people propose, and those are general things for the population. Like I believe that most all people will benefit from a low carb diet. Some will benefit more than others. Um, but those are general principles. Most people will benefit from high quality of sleep and 7 hours of sleep, 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Again, those are population wide things. The next level, though, is individual personalization. In other words, I may have gluten intolerance. I may have celiac disease. I may not be able to tolerate dairy. I may have an MTHFR mutation or ApoE4, alleles or different things like that will change that will change my particular approach to lifestyle. So my lifestyle will be the best lifestyle for me will probably be different than somebody else sitting right next to me based on my genome, but also based on my, other factors. The life I've had, the childhood trauma I've had, back to your expertise and everything, the life I've experienced, the view I look at the world. Is the world a friendly, loving place full of possibility and purpose, or is it a terrible, frightening place that is out to screw me over? You know?
Yeah. So you're a professor. How are you seeing medical education change? I mean, because you obviously had epiphanies, multiple epiphanies in your individual practice. Is new generations of docs coming out of these medical schools? Are they getting educated on epigenetics and nutrition and fitness and other lifestyle factors more than
It's
they were?
more it's more and more. I mean, like we say, it's in the zeitgeist, right? Our national leaders talking about it. So more and more, it's on people's radar, and we're famously seeing the government is mandating that there are 53 med schools that are now going to have nutrition as part of their 40 hours of nutrition or something. So it's changing. I don't believe it's changing fast enough. I'm personally, I spend less time at the medical school now. I mean, I love the years I spent at UCLA and USC medical schools and all the experiences there. But a part of it is to really have an impact right now on a lot of people. I mean, I wrote like 12 textbooks in different places, but textbooks, nobody reads them, or at least my textbooks, they don't read. But then I wrote one book for the public, and it just became like a national bestseller. And I could see I was literally changing people's lives. They're, writing in and, again, it wasn't anything I invented or anything. I'm just communicating knowledge that other people have done through their hard work. But I was able to affect a lot more people. So now I'm spending more of my time focused outward on public facing stuff rather than doing lab work or even directly teaching residents, although I'm still involved with it a little bit, but not as much as before. Before it was full time.
All right. So thank goodness. I mean, not that I don't want you not teaching medical students, but good you have a much broader audience of Americans out there and people from other parts of the world. Because then they can go educate their doctors, ask the questions, and
Yeah.
influence how medicine is practiced. It doesn't just have to come from the doctors. Because I know for years I annoyed the shit out of my doctors. And, in the past 10, 15 years, I found doctors who are more functional or precision based or integrated. So I don't have to annoy them. I learn from them as opposed to like, I remember I would go see a doctor and I'd ask about certain blood tests. They're like, oh, you don't need that. Or I'd ask them about certain readings of certain blood tests. Oh, you're normal. I'm not a doctor, but I don't really think this, I don't want to be normal. I don't want to be average. I want to be,
Yeah.
I think the paradigm is shifting. Thank goodness.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's harder and harder to be effective as a doctor just with the amount of information that is available to the patient, and any doctor who doesn't use AI now is malpractice, or they really should, potentially harming the patient. We need to use AI, and how that's going to play out in the future remains to be seen because it's like we're accelerating into the future at an increasing rate. So it's amazing things are happening.
Are you optimistic? Because you did name certain diseases and the unfortunate increased numbers of humans who are getting it or Americans who are getting it, including much younger people. Are you optimistic that our future will look bright with these changing in paradigms?
Yeah, I am, and it's interesting because these diseases took off about 1980s and 90s. So you can literally see the hockey stick when obesity took off, when diabetes took off, and everything took off. And everyone's saying, well, the obvious question is, what happened in the 1980s? And you go, uh, Coca-Cola and Pepsi got rid of cane sugar and they switched to this new thing called high fructose corn syrup. So that was one thing. And then famously Burger King and McDonald's got rid of beef tallow as
Mhm.
frying. And then fryers all over the world immediately switched to seed oils and those things too. And you can go on and on and on. I'm not necessarily implicating those two. There's parasites, glyphosate, other things that are happening at different times in there. It's just accelerating. Everything is going up. But interestingly, for the first time since the 1980s, we've seen obesity and overweight accelerating to now where in the United States most people are either overweight or obese, right? And for the first time in 30 years, the American Medical Association just published that may be dropping off
Oh,
the first time, and we're going, "Why is that?" Well, of course, it's because GLP-1 agonists, are
oh,
so powerful.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
on the other hand, those drugs they're not just diabetes drugs, they're not just weight loss drugs, which we were first developed for, but now they're FDA approved for sleep apnea. They also work for fatty liver disease. People are investigating them for Alzheimer's. They're looking at them for heart disease. These appear to have a basic metabolic effect across the board beyond just appetite suppression. And in your work, I'm sure you're aware of the fascinating effects on addiction. Where
Yeah, yeah.
half of GLP-1 users spontaneously cut back their alcohol use without any prompting or anything. They're not into alcohol or their cigarettes or their gambling or their cocaine or their porn or their shopping or their, pick your addiction or whatever it is. People just, and also junk food. People like they just instinctively they eat the salad instead of the Doritos, and it's not like they're going, well, I need to eat salad. It's just there's something changing in their brain. It's fascinating, yeah.
It is fascinating.
And not that GLP-1s are a solution, the mantra in lifestyle people is, if you wanna change your lifestyle and you haven't done it yet, well, just try harder, and unfortunately, that doesn't work for everybody, and GLP-1s work, when willpower doesn't work, and for some people, that can be a transition too, where you go on the GLP-1s and you
Yeah.
change your lifestyle on the GLP-1 and then you taper off of it, so
A friend of mine, Victoria Greer, she wrote a piece about the GLP-1s, and she pointed out she wasn't going in support or in opposition to their use, but a lot of people who have obesity, they gain the weight as a defense mechanism against, could be, sexual abuse or something along those lines, unaddressed. And when they lose all the weight, they don't have the protection psychically. I don't mean psychically, but psychologically. So it's like I don't see a lot of psychologists in conversations with medical doctors about the need to start, informing their patients like, hey, if you've had sexual abuse or any kind of abuse, you might have gained the weight to protect yourself because that is a defense mechanism for a lot of people. And you start losing the weight, you might start having things start emerging in your system that you might want to see a psychiatrist or psychologist or a therapist to deal with, which I think is fascinating.
That's such a good point, and you're obviously the expert on it, but yeah, it's always like you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, and at the break, people are always out smoking, right? And they
Yeah.
always have a bowl of candy in the middle of the room because you wanna substitute one addiction, whether it's sugar or tobacco, for the other addiction, and the whole thing with weight loss, if and they found this with bariatric surgery too,
Yeah.
that if you get people to lose weight, whether it's lifestyle or any of these things, if you don't address the underlying root psychological cause, their childhood or what's going on there, then you'll have a thin person, but it'll manifest somewhere else. And I think
Exactly.
that doesn't get nearly enough attention. And thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, no, I think, look, obviously, I agree with you. Uh, one other thing I want to talk about too is circadian biology. It's something I address with my clients a lot, and it seems to me that we have a lot of, especially since the creation of the artificial light, a lot of things in our environment, whether it's artificial light or exogenous chemicals, caffeine, nicotine, THC, all kinds of things that are easily available that can disrupt. I mean, for short-term use for a very particular reason. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about biohacking for a very particular use, but the chronic habitual use of some of these things can throw off our own, biological systems. Is that something that you give some thought to and address in your work as well?
Yeah, I think it's super important, people talk about red light therapy for a long time,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there's actually a medical basis. The red light can affects the mitochondria and improve energy function there. There's a whole emerging science of light wavelengths. Where increasingly we got rid of incandescent lights and we switched to fluorescent, and then finally we switched to LEDs. Because they're so much more energy efficient, but they don't have the same wavelengths
Yeah.
and it appears there's certain healthy wavelengths that we get from incandescent lights that we don't get from these others. So, you can buy red light therapy and put on a mask and
Yeah, yeah,
do
yeah, yeah.
these other things. But the other thing you can do is just get out in the sun, take off, expose your skin and get sunlight. Then you'll get red light, you'll get these other things. And I mean, from personal experience, I was vitamin D deficient. My vitamin D was low, so I took supplements and brought it back to not normal, but optimal, like as we all should.
Nice.
And then I began being aware of the sun and I made an effort to go out in the sun and I cover my face so I don't get sunburned. I don't go out in the high hours of the day. It's mainly I avoid from 10 to 2 more or less. But I go out in the getting sun and I realized after I started doing that, my vitamin D levels came back and I didn't need the supplements anymore. So I went off that. And then simple things like in the morning, getting up, when you fly to a new environment, you get jet lag. Well, get out in the morning and walk around in the sunlight and let the sun reset your circadian rhythms. Even in the day now, I I get up every morning, I walk for an hour before the sun rises, and then the sun comes up, and it's something I really look forward to, and I get my steps in, and then, and then I go to the gym and do different things. So it's a great ritual, but it's connecting me more with the seasons and the time of light coming in, and even things like grounding, taking your shoes off and walking outside, connecting. There's so many things we don't understand that are going. We thought we figured out when we invented Tang, artificial orange juice, or anything we do, we really have to be careful because we really don't understand things. Even all the stuff we've been talking about today, it's just a crude approximation of the reality that's there.
Actually, I really appreciate you saying that because that's the kind of partial definition of science. It's not the thing. You keep having to discover and learn more and more things. It's like a process of discovery. So, like 5 years from now, we're going to look back at how ignorant we were now.
Yeah, yeah. Religion is something that you believe in. Science is something you question, and
Yeah.
it's very
It
different.
reminds me of the Star Trek episode. Did you ever watch the movies? The one where they came back to save the whales?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
Bones was on the USS Enterprise, the aircraft carrier, not the starship, and they're doing a brain surgery on someone. He's like, "Barbarians," because they're going after the skull. Oh my god. Yeah, that's kind of our medicine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the title of my book, "Lies I Taught in Medical School," it's sort of like everyone's going, "What? What are you doing? Why'd you do that?" Well, it's obviously clickbait. I want
Yeah.
people to read the book, but it's referencing one of my favorite doctors, one of the greatest physicians of all time, Sir William Osler, and he has a famous quote about medical education that speaks to medicine and also science in general. He was addressing a group of graduating medical students on the day they finished medical school and became doctors. And he famously said over 130 years ago, he said, "Gentlemen, I have a confession to make. 50% of what we've just taught you is incorrect or outright wrong. The problem is we don't know which half."
Ooh.
And
That's
that's true today too. So
yeah,
yeah.
it's pretty hardcore and very true today. It's interesting, like, tonight I'm seeing my Chinese medicine practitioner. You talked about grounding, you talked about seasonal, like, living within the seasons and stuff like that. And whether it's Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine or some of the more indigenous medicines around the world, they seem to have grok of that as part of their whole system. And it's nice that in the West we're catching up to it, and maybe using the Western model to understand how the mechanism of action, how it actually works, might be different than how the Chinese understood it, thousands of years ago. But it's nice to see, like, because of the global society we live in, we have access to all this stuff. We can learn from each other.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it's such an amazing time to be alive. We're just, amazing opportunities for learning and exploration and everything.
Yeah. So, Rob, where can people learn more about your work, your book, your social media presence, your website, all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah, my website is just my name, robertlufkinmd.com. My book is there. You can download a free chapter on audio or a PDF if you want to try it out. I'm active on social media. My wife says too active, but but look for me there and say hi on any of those channels.
Awesome. I definitely want to encourage folks to do so and check you out on Twitter. That's where I follow you, and you're very active. I don't know about your wife; she might be right about you, but I appreciate the fact you're very active on Twitter because I learned a lot from your work. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate you.
It was a real pleasure, Michael. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.